Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett, and this week we're talking about Bolsa Família, which is a social assistance program in Brazil that they've had since 2003. And some of us read an article from The Economist from actually 2008, so more than a decade ago, but it's still going, and it's still got this article has some interesting points that it brings up, and we've got a few quotes queued up. So I want to start by going around the room and getting people's initial thoughts on Bolsa Familia and how you would relate that to basic income. You know, do we feel like it's moving in the direction of basic income, or to what extent is it moving in that direction? So I'll start with Steve.
Well, I have one big question about it, that you only keep getting the benefit if your kids are in school and if they're vaccinated. My general question is, why wouldn't the parents keep their kids in school and get them vaccinated anyway? And we really have to, incentivize parents to do the right thing. And in general with UBI, do parents know what the right thing is to do?
Okay. Nick.
Yeah, I found myself. I found. I didn't read this article. I read some other thing, and I think it's a serious question. I mean, especially we often in our discussion sort of imagine a world where there's political consensus to kind of fund a basic income without worrying about balancing the budget.
Right.
But we're not there yet. And given that, I think it is kind of I take seriously the kind of the challenge to justify not prioritizing cash transfers to the people in the greatest need. And I think that, so I think that part of it, makes a lot of sense. I would also say about the conditionality, the thing that I looked at was, at least it was saying that in principle, that conditionality is supposed to be kind of both ways. Like the families are supposed to get their kids to school, but also before kicking them out of the program, the government is supposed to, if they're not going to school, help them figure out why and try to help them get their kids to school. And I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah. Meredith?
I'm just gonna listen for a minute.
Okay. Elizabeth?
It feels like one of the sort of many, means test kind of like, oh, we'll give people money, but only poor people and only if they really deserve it. And so not that I think it's a bad thing. I'm okay, great. I would rather that you give to some poor people than not give any money to anyone. But it still feels like it's not really a basic income because it's not. It's okay, only if you are at this under poverty benchmark, only if you're doing these certain things, which feels both inefficient because you have to figure out who that is, and also just not great. But it's okay, I don't know a lot about the Brazilian economy, and so I don't know what it is that they can actually afford to do. To Nick's point about how we're often the government can in fact just print more money, and there are ways that we can manage that so you're not going to get inflation. So I don't know how viable that is for Brazil, but it feels like a lot of the sort of basic income experiments that are better than nothing but don't feel great.
Yeah. Richard?
The vaccinations and schooling are, paternalistic, but in the article they mention 55% of some province or state or whatever that receive it, and most of those the parents are only have a first grade education, so they incentivize have their children go to school, and instead of working on the farm or in a sweatshop making sweaters or whatever, that's maybe a good idea to have some paternalism to point people in the right direction.
Yeah, I think that's right. And to Steve's point, I think for a lot of these people, there is a real cost to sending their kids to school.
Mm-hmm.
There's a real cost to, maybe not as much of a cost, but there's a cost to getting them vaccinated, or how do you even figure out how to do that if you're not used to kind of going to the hospital, paying to see doctors, that kind of thing. So I think it's, it is a clever way of providing that incentive for families to do the things that you want them to do anyway.
The children, well, I don't know what the child labor situation there is, but this might be an economic way to not require child labor,
right,
just to get through the day, and then the children are free.
Or you substitute one form of child labor for another form of child labor, which is sending them to school.
Right.
Yeah, and then you still get paid, or you get paid even more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the parents may have never been to school and may actually might not understand what the whole deal is with school and reading and all of that.
Yeah.
Well,
And
well, even if they do, there's often a cost to being okay, if both parents are working, who's going to get the kid on the school bus? How, I don't know how exactly it works in a lot of Brazil, but I imagine that there's often transportation costs that there's not necessarily yes, there's a regularly scheduled municipal free bus that picks your kids up from your house at a time that is convenient for you. If you're well, I have to rearrange my being a maid at somebody's house schedule to get my kid on the bus, when you're well, instead I could just leave my kid with my sister and my sister will entertain him all day, and that's
and I think that's another great example of the costs of sending kids to school that this kind of helps compensate for. But yeah, it would be nice if, in some sense, it would be nice if people could get the money and just get the money, and then they don't if you're getting the money, but then you have to pay this cost, that can be harder. It would be, if they could put the infrastructure in place to make it easier, to the transportation easier, to lessen some of these costs instead of just kind of canceling them out with money. Maybe you could give them money and they wouldn't have to pay these costs as much, and that feels kind of like a better ideal, to kind of work toward. And to your point earlier, Elizabeth, I think you're right that it's not a basic income in a lot of ways. It's conditional. It's conditioned on sending kids to school and getting them vaccinated, and then it's means tested. It only goes to poor people. I think it only goes to mothers of poor families. I think that's kind of how it's set up.
It has the benefits cliff.
Right.
So if you accidentally start making money, then you become poorer because you lose.
That's right.
Bolsa Família benefits.
And that can push people more into the informal economy too, which the government obviously doesn't want, because then it's harder to collect taxes and all of that. But it does have something really big, which is that it has no work requirement, and that's something that is one of the main benefits of basic income, is that people need money regardless of anything else, and sometimes the most efficient or most useful, valuable work that someone can do is not something that is what we would think of normally as a job, not something that would be paid, and if you have a work requirement as one of the conditions on these types of programs, now you are preventing people from potentially doing all kinds of useless work the kind of work they would normally choose to do, like a mother staying home with their children, for example, or anyone doing any kind of thing that's valuable to them, valuable to their family or community, that wouldn't ordinarily be paid. Yeah. I think this is something that's been in place since 2003, and it's still in place today. And I think they've seen this article is from a while ago, but they've seen that it's had some of the results that they want to see. We'll get Bethany's initial thoughts on Bolsa Família, and then maybe we'll check out the article.
I don't have any yet.
No initial thoughts on Bolsa Família. Anyone else have any more comments before we start the article? Okay. So this article, yeah, Richard.
Well, there's a new program that started several years ago, but they increased the numbers of it from several hundred to 52,000, I believe it is, and it's in the Rio suburb, of America, and they have their own local currency, the Mumbunko, which they even have their own bank, and they dispense it with debit cards, and it's to the poor families or whatever in the city, and they can use the currency to buy like whatever businesses accept it, and they hope that it keeps the money in the province rather than being spread elsewhere.
Right. Yeah, this is like a local complementary currency type thing that they're using to implement a local cash transfer program for the citizens of this city. And I think you mentioned it started a few years ago. They've had this kind of complementary currency, and they've recently proposed expanding it, expanding the payout and expanding the number of people who receive it.
It's funded by oil. It's not like in Alaska. They use investments to determine the amounts of money that they receive, but they just get it directly from oil without investing in this program.
Okay. Yeah, and that could probably be a whole discussion unto itself. So yeah, let's get started with the article.
Cool.
Bolsa Familia works as follows. So this is kind of like the introduction for anyone who's not familiar with it. Where a family earns less than 120 reais, $68 per head per month, mothers are paid a benefit of up to 95 reais.
I always thought it was reals.
Real is the singular, reais is the plural. Portuguese. So mothers are paid a benefit up to 95 of these things on condition that their children go to school and take part in government vaccination programs. Municipal governments do much of the collection of data on eligibility and compliance, but payments are made by the federal government. Each beneficiary receives a debit card which is charged up every month unless the recipient has not met the necessary conditions, in which case, and after a couple of warnings, the payment is suspended. So this is related to what Nick was talking about, how instead of just saying, okay, you failed to meet the requirements, we're going to cut you off, they actually try to figure out what's going on and help people get back on it. Yeah, go ahead.
So I just read the next sentence that it's a quarter of Brazil's population.
Yes.
I guess that makes me curious. I have no context for the purchasing power of $68 per head per month in Brazil. Yeah, like I don't have a good sense of kind of where they set the limit for the benefit.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's pretty small, but more than $68 would be here. Yeah, I think most of the families receiving this are kind of at the level that we would consider very poor, and a lot of Brazil's population is kind of in that category.
So that's an important an accurate interpretation of that.
Yes. Yep. Anyone have any thoughts on just now that it's been kind of defined here?
I guess it's an interesting idea to have it be contingent on school and vaccinations, and I kind of wonder, like, did they have a lot of issues? I assume they've had issues with those things, or they wouldn't have thought to tie this to them.
And I think part of the reason they tie it to school especially is because they're imagining it as a temporary program where you can kind of kickstart the economy or kickstart the society and get all the children educated so then they grow up and then they can earn money for themselves and then we don't need Bolsa Familia anymore, that kind of thing.
I was thinking of something else, which is that you might have an economic incentive to put your kids to work, either begging or in a job of some kind or whatever, and so like it might be necessary to I wonder if in order to get the kids to go to school, you really have to.
Yeah, we talked about that a little bit before you got here, and I think that's certainly part of it. There are costs that families pay for sending their kids to school, and we talked about Elizabeth brought up ways that maybe some of those costs could be reduced without just saying, hey, we'll pay you money if you send your kids to school, that kind of thing. But there's so it's an interesting question if we just think about it, like, well, why aren't parents sending their kids to school? But exactly the kind of stuff you're talking about, having them work and earn an income for the family. Now they can do that by virtue of going to school.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And statistically, I guess there's a lot of effects of like girls in particular going to school on age of first pregnancy and stuff like that, that they might feel is helpful for the next generation.
Yeah, maybe. Yep.
I also wonder how, whether part of it is a political calculation, that it's easier to maintain political support for a conditional program versus
That's
an
interesting.
unconditional program.
Right.
It is an interesting question because I've always thought that if you have a universal program, then there would be fewer people thinking of it as something that goes to those people and more universal support, kind of like with Social Security. But could it be?
But this is not a universal program.
Right. So could there be a political benefit in the other direction, I guess is the question.
Still 3/4 of Brazilians don't get this.
Right, yeah.
So maybe it's easier for them to swallow if they see that these people who are doing it are, in some sense, being controlled or having to give something up.
Or it's like affecting them indirectly because they live in a society with less illness or like crime or something like, so they feel like there's a benefit to them. Or
I mean that would still be true even if.
But I guess if they're assuming that like sending kids to school and getting the vaccinations in particular are having these like positive effects for their society. Then.
Like, there are these people who aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. Let's do this thing to get them on the right track, and then they won't have to be, dependent on this stuff.
Is that your
anymore.
idea, Nick? That like maybe that's more politically tenable for them?
I think mine was a more cynical idea that it would just seem like an unfairly good deal to make it unconditional.
I see.
And to have it be, that kind of paternalism might be something that...
Right, to have it unconditional but still means tested, so poor people get it and they don't have to do anything or something like that.
Yeah, even if they're if they're undeserving.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think the means testing probably makes it less popular politically because so many people don't get it, and then the conditionality can maybe help make up for that a little bit in people's minds. Like, okay, we're giving these people this special thing, but we're making them have to earn it by doing the right thing or something like that. Yeah.
Do you know, like, in terms of comparison, to try to think about like politics in the U.S., do you know what percentage of people in the U.S. get some kind of government benefit if you include disability and TANF and all those different kinds of programs? Is it similar? I should know this. I guess
far fewer than actually would qualify for those programs.
Right. I know it's like something like for each program, somewhere between 10% and 60%, depending on the program, of the people who qualify actually get it.
Interesting. So it's probably less than 25% of the population getting it then.
Yeah, because if it's 10% of the people who qualified, if the entire population qualified, it'd still be
probably fair.
Yeah.
I guess I was thinking of Nick's points about like.
But that's also on a per program basis, so it could be that someone qualifies for 8 different programs, but they're only receiving one of them or something like that. So then maybe the answer to your question is a little bit higher. It could be up to 10-15%. It also depends on what you're defining as a benefit program. Like is housing
interest deduction.
Yeah, is that one of them?
What did you say?
Mortgage interest.
Mortgage
interest deduction. Yeah.
Well, like 99% of Americans are benefiting from some federal program.
Right.
Yes.
And,
so that's
and
a
some
good
a very small amount know that.
Right.
That's a good
Yeah,
point.
and that includes people who have jobs that were created through monetary policy and that kind of stuff.
100%.
100% of Americans are receiving some kind of benefit and some kind of cost from government programs.
I was
and for some of them, the cost outweighs the benefit.
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking of something more specific, which is like when people are talking about Andrew Yang's plan or other things, obviously the question of how to pay for it comes up, and people are concerned about tying it to taxes, and obviously this is only a quarter of the population, and maybe it's not that much money, even in Brazilian terms, but I was just it is still kind of like a large number, so I was interested in how their debates around the cost of it worked, given that it's probably a pretty substantial part of their budget.
Yeah, it's an interesting question.
It was 0.7% of their GDP, I think it said.
Okay, so that's not it's not small, but it's not huge.
Right.
Yeah.
The internet says 42 million people are on food stamps.
42 million people, so 15%. Yeah, something like that.
Thanks. That's
Yeah.
context.
Yeah. Okay.
So here in the U.S., it's required that you send your kids to school, or you find some way to homeschool that you do. Is it
Yeah.
required in Brazil that children go to school?
My guess is that it would be hard to enforce such a requirement through law enforcement. So they're requiring it, but maybe the way they're requiring it is saying that if you don't send them, we don't pay you, that kind of thing.
And the other thing is here, if you're going to public school, you have to have had certain vaccinations
Right.
to be admitted to the school. So that's how we get that accomplished here.
Yep.
And this is, it's anti-poverty in its own way here. So they're doing a similar thing here.
Yeah, that's a really good
So
point. Yeah.
those are the benefits we have here that are just, we have a different way of doing it.
Yeah.
There's no extra bonus incentive.
Yeah, and that makes sense why it's these two things, which
Right.
we might not intuitively associate with each other, but they're associated here, as you're pointing out.
I think this is just make healthy members of the population by having kids be vaccinated and educated, but also this can go towards maybe they get more food
Yeah.
and are better nourished, and so they grow up, because children is such a important part of it's being a child is such a I'm sorry. It's a sensitive place where there's so much growth and development. If you don't intervene, then you can have a lot of problems later.
Yeah.
And I guess this kind of reminds me again of Nick's point about, well, it only goes to mothers of children, right? So in terms of making,
It's paid to the mothers, but it's on a per head basis. So everyone.
but if you're
for
a
number
single
of people.
adult without any kids, do you get it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it might only go to families that have mothers in them.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what I'm wondering. So I guess I'm thinking about how, like Nick said, that people are resistant to just like giving people money, but maybe the justification for it is that these are the children are kind of innocent. It's not their fault that they're born into a poor family. Whereas people often tend to blame adults, like it's their responsibility at that point to be making money. But with kids, there's this other case that people make where they shouldn't have to like grow up without money because they didn't get a chance yet, kind of a thing.
Yeah. Oh, I should correct what I just said. I was reading that wrong, as Mitchell just pointed out. He says, what is the mean or median of the family fund benefit pay? That's Bolsa Familia. The article says up to 95 reais. So it's the per head thing is
It's what they
about
earn.
who qualifies. A family earns less than
Yeah.
$68 per month. Then the mothers are paid a benefit up to 95
Right.
reais on condition that their children go to school. So yeah, I don't know what the average is. It probably depends on the. It might phase out with income. It might depend on the number of children in the family, that kind of thing. Yeah.
But it seems like it's only for people with kids.
It seems like it's only for people with kids. Yeah. Unlike basic income. I think the most basic income like thing here is that there's no work requirement.
What's the age of maturity in Brazil?
I don't know.
It might be like 18, because I'm looking at education, and so education is free and compulsory for kids between the ages of 6 and 14. Then upper secondary education from ages 15 to 18 is also free but not compulsory.
Yeah.
So my guess is about 18 for age of majority. The internet also suggests that the free schools are far inferior to the schools you have to pay for. That it's like, well, yes, technically you can send your kids to free schools, but like they're not great. That like most of the like middle class sends their kids to private schools.
So it sounds similar to here.
Well, maybe more so though.
Maybe more so. And I
Because
think
here we have the weird thing where like property taxes fund the schools, so there are like good public schools in wealthy neighborhoods.
yes, in wealthy neighborhoods, yeah. Yeah, and I think the healthcare system in Brazil is also very similar. Like they have free healthcare, but if you want decent healthcare, you have to pay for it. If you want to not have to wait 6 months for your appointment, you have to pay for it, that kind of thing. So we see these kinds of things. So yeah, I wonder to what extent Bolsa Familia can contribute to parents being able to pay for their kids to go to school. My guess is that the amount that you get is not enough to.
Yeah, I mean,
that once you have enough money to send your kids kids to private school, you're not qualifying for.
Well, because
Bolsa
you can
Familia
only get
anymore,
up to 95, and if you make less than 120 per person, and that's considered poor, then it's not bumping you up that much. I don't have a good sense for those amounts, but just comparing them to each other.
Yeah. So another important aspect of Bolsa Familia is that since it goes to 25% of the population, it's being distributed across the entire economy. So we would see, unlike basic income experiments, which are also limited in a lot of the ways this is limited, but unlike those, you can actually see some macroeconomic effects. You can see what happens when consumers have access to more spending money and that kind of thing. And the article gets into that a little bit later. So I think this is kind of like, if you want to talk about that aspect of basic income, you can point to something like Bolsa Familia.
Like the kind of economic stimulus component?
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
In terms of how poor it is, this is like a study by the UNDP found that talks about families in poverty is making under half the minimum wage per capita. So the sort of the poverty level that this is going to sounds like about sort of what we would expect.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. You guys ready for another quote?
Yeah.
In the northeastern state of Alagoas, one of Brazil's poorest, over half of the families get Bolsa Familia. Most of the rest receive a state pension. It's like Sweden with sunshine, says Cicero Pericles de Carvalho, an economist at the Federal University of Alagoas. Up to a point, some 70% of the population in Alagoas is either illiterate or did not complete first grade at school. Life expectancy at birth is 66, 6 years below the average for Brazil. So this is an area where, when it says receive a state pension, they're talking about old age, their equivalent of Social Security. So either people are getting, old age pension, or they are a retirement pension, or they're receiving Bolsa Familia. Yeah. So yeah, I mean it's an interesting thing because you have this national program, and then there are certain regions that are poorer than others. So you'd see kind of a larger effect in some regions than others as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone have any thoughts on that before we continue?
Not only that, I'm just continuing to read the Wikipedia article about this, but on the sort of benefits to being able to send your kids to school is that apparently children in public schools receive 1 free meal a day, and 2 in the poorest areas. So it has this it's not exactly a positive shock, but if you're able to send your kids to school, you have to spend less on feeding them, and they're overall, and the.
So that's another incentive to send them.
Yeah.
Okay. Mitchell says that those aged 16 or older can be emancipated upon marriage by being approved for civil service, by graduating in college, or for being economically independent, according to Wikipedia.
Okay.
So this is the next one. As well as providing immediate help to the poor, Bolsa Familia aims in the long run to break this culture of dependency by ensuring that children get a better education than their parents. There are some encouraging signs. School attendance has risen in Alagoas, as it has across the country, thanks in part to Bolsa Familia and an early program called Bolsa Escola. So this is very much different from how we think about basic income. We think of basic income as a permanent thing that people are going to be getting forever.
Depending on.
What's that?
And depending on.
Yeah,
And depending on forever, yeah.
Yeah.
And here they're still designing it with this mindset of figuring out how to break families out of dependence on cash assistance programs from the government. So this is a very, very much, even if it has some similar effects to basic income, the goals behind it are very much different. Some people who talk about basic income also see this as a goal, it'll help people get better jobs and give them more flexibility in the labor market and help them support themselves better. But we generally, since basic income goes to everyone, we don't think of it as this kind of like temporary thing. I think, here they still have this idea that the economy is supposed to work a certain way, and it just needs a temporary, stimulus to kind of get it out of the funk, or get the people out of the situation that they're in, rather than acknowledging that well, wait a minute, this is, an economy can continue to work like this.
Yeah. I guess even in addition to the idea of getting off of Bolsa Familia, there's also other positive benefits that come from some of these things. So like I mentioned that women often have more options. I don't know all the statistics. It's possible they might be less likely to end up in an abusive relationship. I think it is true that they tend to have kids later.
You're talking about basic income, or you're talking about
school attendance? So this paragraph is saying that school attendance will help them not be dependent.
I was trying to figure out if you're talking about Bolsa Familia or you're talking about basic income.
Okay, let me start over.
Yeah, go ahead.
This paragraph is saying that via school, they're hoping people will get off of Bolsa Familia, right?
Right.
But I'm saying that like via school, there's other benefits. So even if you, for example, don't feel like people should have to get off of like a basic income, there's other benefits.
Oh yeah.
It's not that important of a point.
Yes, there's all kinds of
pointing
benefits to going to school. I agree with that. Yeah.
And being vaccinated.
Yeah,
and getting vaccinated too.
Right, exactly.
And I would argue that, school and education and just, intellectual enrichment, that kind of thing, that can be an end in itself. It doesn't have to be for the purpose of getting a job and earning more money later. And I think that's what they're emphasizing here with this. Like, we want to educate people so they can get jobs. We want to educate people so they can support themselves.
I'm sure that's part of it.
Yeah.
But I bet there are a lot of like complicated problems with poverty that they're hoping this helps. And I guess I'm just saying that some of those might actually be effective.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
I'm agreeing with that. I think, it does, giving people money is very powerful. And that's something that's true here as it is with basic income.
But also even just getting people to go to school without giving them money when they've done that is also powerful.
Getting people to go to school is very powerful as well.
But I don't know how we feel about like forcing people to go to school, but from the studies that I've seen, when they incentivize parents to, or make parents get their kids to school.
Yeah, how do we feel about that? How do you feel about that?
I don't know yet.
Yeah. I think Elizabeth does not feel good about it. How do I feel about it is a question. I want measures in place to help people go to school, and I want measures in place to help people have money.
Yeah.
But, should we combine the two? I mean, a lot of times when you try to combine two different things with two different goals, you end up not doing either one as efficiently as you could. So I would argue that that's probably true here. But if you can't have either one, like if one is an excuse for the other, then, and that's the only way it's going to happen, then that's better than nothing, I guess is what I would say. Yeah. I don't know. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah, and I guess there's different questions. Like there's how we feel about school being mandatory in general, and then there's the question of tying it to the Bolsa Familia.
Right.
As Meredith pointed out, or I think Meredith said, that we require people to go to school here, but we don't give them any financial compensation. We just require it.
Yeah, I mean, we have the incentives. I mean, you get fined or penalized, or you go to jail or something if you don't send you lose your kids. Yeah, I mean, like, so that's roughly equivalent to kind of paying people to go to school in terms of.
But it's different from your point of view, because it's like it's not the same as tying it to like a basic income program or something, because it's not necessarily going to have the same inefficiencies.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Ready for the next one? The scheme has also helped to push the rate of economic growth in the poor Northeast above the national average. This has helped to reduce income inequality in Brazil, although only 30% of Alagoas's labor force of 1.3 million has a formal job. More than 1.5 million of its people had a mobile phone last year. That would be 2007, so it's probably even higher now. The poor are living Chinese rates of growth, says Elósio Mercadante, a senator for Sao Paulo state, repeating a proud boast of the governor's Workers' Party. So yeah, I mean, I think this is like the key thing, and it's probably not designed to. I mean, it's designed to help people, so then people can participate in the economy and then work their way out to support themselves and maybe be productive members of society when they grow up or something like that, help families break the cycle of poverty. When they designed it, my guess is they probably weren't thinking as much about the direct economic stimulus effect of people have money to spend now. That allows us to create businesses to sell things to those people. They all become customers, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Let me ask you something about the mobile phone business.
Yeah.
I think he's mentioning that he's mentioning mobile phones as just a fancy thing to own.
Yes.
Okay.
I believe that's the.
All right.
Yeah.
Or an important thing to own if you're going to interact with people and
if you're going to
do anything
participate in the
productive.
informal economy.
Because they probably
Yeah.
don't have computers or anything like that.
Well, I'm thinking like in the Give Directly or in India, the UBI programs and other parts of the economy are sort of, they're leapfrogging, the industrial age, and they're using smartphones for their banking,
Right.
for their money.
Give Directly is in Kenya.
Yeah,
Not even smartphones necessarily either. They do it like via SMS, the M-Pesa thing.
Right.
Yeah.
yeah. So what mobile phone means to me is skipping to the modern era
Yeah.
of economics and communication and money distribution and banking and all of that stuff that's happening around the world.
Leapfrogging over landlines.
At least.
Yeah.
And maybe right over cash as happening in
Yeah.
some
And
parts of the world.
over computers, laptops, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. I think this is kind of like an effect that is there when you are giving the payout, and then it goes away when you're not giving the payout anymore, right? Because you're funding the consumer spending directly. So I think imagining Bolsa Familia as something temporary, if you're doing that, then you are missing out on this very clear benefit of economic growth. Yeah.
Whereas if if it was food stamps, but what you knew you really needed was a mobile phone to get your business going,
Right.
you would not be able to buy a mobile phone. But if you're just given cash, then you can
Yes.
be smarter than the government, than the conservative government, and just catch up with modern times and do what you need to do.
Yep.
A lot
I
of
think
people
that's a
who
really good
have
point.
food stamps buy soda or something, and then
Yeah.
they sell it to people for like half the price so they can
Yeah, I
get
read
money.
about that. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, it's pretty inefficient. Yeah. Okay. Guys, ready for another one? We're burning through these pretty quick.
I know, this is quite
We're
the,
gonna have to think of something else to talk about.
quite the one, yeah.
I've got some ideas over here. I didn't want to throw you off track, so.
No, go ahead.
The,
Yeah, what do you got?
This would be backing up to what Bethany was talking about earlier
Yeah.
about what happens when you send women to school or women have children later in life. There is something called the demographic transition. This is when a population goes from having lots of children to having only kind of like a replacement amount of children. And that occurs when they know that the ones that they have are gonna live.
Yeah.
So with some help over here, somebody Googled what's the average number of kids in Brazil per family, and it's like 1.9.
Yeah.
And actually in this northeast area, it's even less than that, it's 1.8. So they've already reached that level.
Right.
So it's not, economically, it's not like a further thing that's going on
Right.
with the benefit. I mean,
That's
maybe-
interesting.
I mean, I was looking at it from the point of, okay, these kids are getting vaccinated.
Right.
And they're getting like a health benefit this way, so maybe more of them will survive, but it's already very good there.
Yeah.
So that's good.
Yeah.
Something that's been on my mind though is that Venezuela's had a horrible time and many of their people left and went to Brazil. So I don't know what's happening now with this program, but I imagine, I don't know if the immigrants can qualify.
Are they eligible? It's interesting.
But you have a whole new source of poverty entering the country. So it's
Wow, yeah.
It's 44 million people there from the article in 2008. I don't know how many millions came from Venezuela.
Yeah.
They have a new challenge.
That's a really interesting question, how that's affecting their economy and everything, yeah. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, so those were the side thoughts.
Yeah. We actually had we had one of these on the Venezuela crisis last year.
Yeah.
We talked about that. We also had one on
Population.
On
That kind of
population
stuff you're
growth.
talking
Yeah.
about,
Yeah, so one thing that we worry about sometimes with something like a basic income is, do you give it to children, and then are you paying parents to have children, and then does that cause a population problem?
Right.
And it's interesting because this one actually does go to families with children, and it sounds like it's not causing a population problem. It sounds like the birth rate is fairly sustainable.
Although
So,
we don't
yeah.
know if it's adjusted to the number of children.
What's that?
We don't know if it's adjusted to the number of children.
If the payout is adjusted to the number of children.
And we also
Yeah.
don't know if it's like kind of low relative to the cost of each additional child. Like I don't again like which would make a difference for how it affects birth.
I mean, it's a matter of degree, right? So if you lessen the cost, that's also
But
providing
there
more
might be a
incentive.
tipping point. Like it might not incentivize having more kids until it's at least a little bit bigger than the cost of raising the next kid. I guess you'd say.
I mean, there's
continuous.
when you're deciding whether to have kids, there's always a
There's
cost
many
benefit
factors.
trade-off, and if you lessen the cost, then it shifts the trade-off.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not going to be like one point where it flips over to being worth it.
Nevertheless, it might be quite far from the cost of raising
Yes.
a kid.
But the marginal cost of the 10th kid
Right.
is small. The marginal cost of the first kid is large, and so the payments should.
Yeah, like cheaper by the dozen.
Yeah.
Well, here they had that up to a certain amount.
Right.
Right.
It's an interesting question. Yeah, if someone wants to look up how the payouts are structured, like how do you get more? Do you get more if you have more kids? I think there is kind of what Steve described, like the first kid you get some amount, second kid, and then it either gradually
Diminishing
diminishes.
marginal return.
Well, the payout either diminishes or it stops after the second kid or something like that.
Yeah, there's a World Politics Review article from, I'm not sure what year, that says, efficiency aside, some point out how modest the transfer is. Under the program, families receive only approximately $15 per child with a monthly cap of a little more than $150. So that sounds like it does actually get you're allowed up to 10 kids on that, which sounds fake, but
They might just be averaging it out per child rather than saying that for each child you get an additional $15. You know what I mean?
yeah.
Okay. Do you have any more thoughts, Meredith?
No, I'm sorry. I don't want. I think it's interesting the way this goes further in the article, and they say that people started making their own businesses. So.
Yes, that is interesting. Look hard enough, and it is also possible to find businesses spawned by this consumption boom among the poor. Pedro dos Santos and his wife, Daisy, started a soap factory with 20 reais at their home in an impoverished neighborhood on the edge of Maceió, the state capital. So this is exactly kind of what I was mentioning before, that if you have a bunch of people who now have money, now you have a bunch of potential customers. You can do stuff like this.
And presumably that affected the bank's willingness to fund them too.
Yes, for sure. You can borrow money if you can demonstrate that there are people you're going to be able to sell to make the money back. Yes.
And that you have a stable income from the child benefit already.
Right. That's what, and you yourself have the income. Yeah, that's a good point too. If everybody, I mean, I don't know if there's more to say on this. If everybody's a potential customer, then there's no point in starting a soap business if your customers don't have the money to buy the soap. Yeah.
I just want to say that soap and hand washing is awesome and great for health. Public
Yes.
health. So this is wonderful.
Yeah, and it's great that's the business, that's the kind of business you see emerge when this happens, because that's one of the basic things that's going to help them the most. Yeah.
But in America, for instance, Well, in America, there's so many regulations. Is it even legal to just make and sell soap without having to file some forms and get some inspections and all that? I know that you can't just, I don't think you can just sell food or open a restaurant or.
There's a lot of those around food. I think you could just sell soap. I think a lot of people do it on Etsy, but it's food. If you're have like a restaurant, there's a lot of like health code stuff in the U.S. So.
Yeah, and you can't build things. I think you can't be a cosmetologist or.
But people probably
I think
do
there's
it.
also where the government thinks that there's a lot of potential harm if you mess it up. That they're like, if you are building things or like injecting things into people's bodies or like putting food into their bodies, that like we want to make sure. I mean, not that that's like how the bureaucratic regulations actually play out often, but I think that's the motivation of like we want to protect people from unqualified, possibly malicious people who are just going to be like, oh yeah, I definitely know how to do this. I saw it on YouTube once. Like, no flaws in this plan.
We have a friend who is a pilgrim at Plymouth Plantation.
Oh, yeah.
And she grows, all of this food in her garden there. And she's not allowed, she like cooks food in front of people and makes soup and stuff like that. She's not allowed to feed it to any of the visitors, but she can hand it out to her friends. So
Nice.
sometimes there's food available. But yeah, this is kind of the thing you're talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
So, well, this is why I consider UBI to be a part of a libertarian policy, because UBI and a minimum of regulation is what's needed to get capitalism working better.
Yeah, I mean, I think basic income on its own is not going to end these regulations on food safety and stuff like that. But it might, once we have a basic income in place that's at a high enough level, it might help us realize that we don't need maybe some of the regulations in the labor market and stuff like that. Yeah.
So Andrew Yang wants to sunset a lot of, pretty much every law, so that you have to pass it again every 10 years or whatever it is. And couldn't your friend like sell things at like a farmer's market or something?
Yeah, potentially. I don't know what the regulations are for farmers markets, and I don't even know if this rule is a Plymouth Plantation rule because they don't want to have liability, that kind of thing, or if it's a legal thing, or yeah. I don't know where the restrictions are coming from.
Yeah.
Necessarily. Yeah. Yeah.
They do serve food on Thanksgiving, but that's like a special thing.
Yeah, I think that's probably a special thing that they get,
Probably
insurance
like
for and a permit or something.
Stuff,
yeah, that's right. And even when we go to Burning Man, like if you just show up and you're in your camp, you can eat your own food. But once your camp is above a certain number of people,
or if like you're giving out food,
or if you're giving out food, then you have to like get a special permit.
You
that
do,
kind of thing.
yeah. You have to get a permit. I got one time.
Yeah. For
give out
s'mores.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We didn't really have all the things. Well, I shouldn't say that on camera. We were in full compliance of the permit the entire
Good
time.
job being in full compliance.
Yeah.
Thank you, State of Nevada.
Yeah. You guys ready for another one? Yeah. Despite the early success of Bolsa Familia, 3 concerns remain. The first is over fraud. Because money is paid directly to the beneficiary's debit card, there is little scope for leakage. The question is whether local governments are collecting accurate data on eligibility and enforcing the conditions. Some 15% of municipal councils make the improbable claim that 100% of pupils are in school 100% of the time. Despite this, most of the money does go to the right people. 70% ends up in the pockets of the poorest, 20% of families the World Bank finds. So this is a problem that kind of goes away if you have a basic income, because you're not trying to figure out who's eligible and who's not.
I guess it depends on if any of the fraud is like somebody stealing somebody else's card and like that person not getting the money and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I don't know how they deal with that kind of stuff. We've talked about that.
Yeah, we've talked about that in the context of food stamps. So I think if someone steals your card outright, you're likely to say, hey, my card got stolen, can I get a replacement? if you make some kind of deal with someone to say, you know, like, hey, here's my card, if you give me money now or something like that, that's something that happens a lot with SNAP, with food stamps, because, you know, people, partly because it's restricted in what you can buy.
Right. I think I was thinking more of like when we've talked about your Gresham system, you know, you've talked about how to prevent them getting stolen or resold or that kind of thing.
Right. Like if I come to you and say, you know, I will do this, give you this thing that you really need, but in exchange, you owe me all of your Bolsa Familia benefits for the next forever or 10 years or something like that. How do you prevent something like that from happening?
Yeah, and we skipped over like some other things about corruption, like people buying votes is really, really common, that kind of stuff. So it tends to, it sounds like it's a general culture of corruption in that area, and so I wonder if they have issues with that kind of thing.
They get to it in point 3,
Oh,
which
do
I
they?
bet is going to be 2 quotations from now.
Yes, it is.
Interesting.
Yeah, well, actually, there's actual vote buying. Vote buying.
They said before that people will literally pay you $50 or 50 reais to buy your vote.
So that you literally pay them for the vote.
And it's so accepted that people complain publicly that the politician, or like complain to the Bolsa Familia people that the politician hasn't paid them yet. So
it's not the Bolsa Familia people.
Or to somebody, I don't know.
And there's a general vote buying problem in Brazil.
Yeah.
That's not tied to Bolsa Familia.
No, I know. I'm just saying that like the fact that you have that raises my sense of how likely it is that there's other problems with people's cards being like bought and sold for various reasons, even if they're not supposed to be, because it doesn't seem like there's either a cultural climate nor a legal climate that's able to clamp down on this kind of thing.
I mean, I feel like, you know, intuitively there should be enough of an incentive where if you're supposed to get this benefit and somehow it's been taken away from you, that you would report that.
Well, it depends on how bad things are there. Maybe there's like violence that people hold over people. Maybe there's like sexual violence. There could be all sorts of problems that are going on.
And it could also be maybe there's corruption in the people who are supposed to be administering the program.
Right. They get like give special favors.
Give it to dead people, and then they get they keep the cards for themselves, and they sort of like with voting in the like decades
or they like
ago.
write down that you have extra people in your family if that helps you get more.
So these things are all problems you could have with an actual basic income.
Yeah, totally. I mean, this isn't really like a flaw in the system of trying to give people money. It's just if you don't have a good culture or legal situation.
Yes.
Then it's
if you're operating in a corrupt system with corrupt government and corrupt politics, then you might be concerned about something like Bolsa Familia being operated in a non-corrupt way.
But I mean, I agree with them that it's still better than not having it probably. But then you could, I guess, ask if you could shift it in any different kinds of ways to make it more resilient.
Right. Could you design the program so that it's more robust against these kinds of failures? Yeah.
So we're still not sure what the buying power of the benefit is. It might not really be a whole lot of money for people to really get, you know,
it's pretty
exploiting each other for.
I mean, it's pretty small. My sense is that it was set at a level that they wanted to set it at to get all the kids to go to school and to get vaccinated.
So it's meaningful.
That it wasn't necessarily about providing families with income. Maybe a little bit. Yeah. I mean, I guess it is a little bit.
Is it a one-time payment, or is this like a monthly?
This is a monthly, recurring monthly payment. So the debit card gets refilled every month.
Okay.
Yeah.
So like, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think we were talking about what the buying power is. I think it's hard to kind of like define it in terms of we live in a very different economy, but it's clearly enough that you could start a business and sell soap to people. And you know, they had some other examples of businesses that people started too.
Totally.
So it is.
They started their business with 20 Rhea, and you can get up to 90 with it.
Right. So my sense is that you could certainly, if you had a way of getting these things from people or coercing them out of people, that like it would be worth it to some people.
You know, that kind of thing.
Especially if you get enough of them together. You know,
right.
That kind of thing.
Right. So I mean, I guess one thing you could do is like not having it be a physical card. I don't know if there's like a password. Hopefully there's like a password associated with the card.
Like a PIN?
Like a PIN, I would assume.
It's a debit card.
That would be pretty silly if there wasn't.
Yeah.
And then you can like report it stolen and change your PIN. But I guess if we're worried about their legal culture, that's...
Well, yeah, I mean, if someone has, is coercing you and has, kind of leverage over you and they make you give them the PIN and make you not report it, then, But I mean, I think that kind of stuff it's not a reason not to do something like this,
Right.
right? You know, there's always going to be some level of corruption and coercion, and
It might be a reason to administer more of it at the national level. It sounds like there's more corruption in some of these areas where a lot of people are getting it.
it actually, I think it said it is administered at the national level,
But they
and
said-
at the local level, it's just a matter of collecting the data about compliance.
Right. So that
Yeah.
could lead to like, I mean, if this kind of, I mean, I guess it's hard for the national government to deal with this kind of data, but
Right.
it does make
And
sense.
the federal government, well, the president or whatever was overthrown a few months ago
That's fair.
from an oil scandal or something.
Right.
That
So
was-
the federal government might not be that much better.
Wait a minute. Brazil, isn't Bolsonaro still president in Brazil?
They just
Yeah.
said though that Fernando Collor was forced to
This
resign.
is from 2008.
Oh, I see.
The governor or that governor, the president or whatever was overthrown. He like resigned or something.
I thought that was a different country.
I'm quite sure it was
Lula
Brazil.
was imprisoned under. He was about to win the election, but he was imprisoned under suspicious circumstances, and then he couldn't win the election, and so Bolsonaro was elected.
Right.
Sort of a mess.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. That's how Bolsonaro got reelected. Okay.
I think that's how we got in the first time. I mean, I think he's still.
Or that's how he got in the first time. Okay. Yeah, interesting. I think there was a country recently that had
It happened in Puerto Rico a few months ago as well.
I was thinking of Puerto Rico, which isn't a country, but yeah, I was thinking of Puerto Rico. Okay. So this one, yeah, I think, you know, it's reasonable to be concerned about fraud. I wouldn't say that that counts against Bolsa Familia because there's going to be fraud in no matter what you do.
I guess it's a good point too. Like if you have to have an eligibility requirement and there's a lot of corruption, then like some people could also be being denied the money because they're not in good favor with like the municipality or something like that.
Yeah. Or potentially not receiving the benefit because of just inefficiencies in the system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right, like we were talking about here with
Yeah.
a lot of people being eligible on it.
Yep. Okay. Second, some people worry that Bolsa Familia will end up as a permanent feature of Brazilian society rather than a temporary boost aimed at changing the opportunities available to the poorest. Whether this happens will depend largely on whether Brazil's public schools improve fast enough to give all their new pupils a reasonable education. Since the scheme began on a large scale only in 2003, it's still too early to tell. Obviously, this was 11 years ago, so maybe it's not too early to tell anymore. But more importantly than that, this is again emphasizing that they don't want it to be a permanent thing, which is the opposite of basic income, which we think of as like a permanent change to the way the economy works.
I mean, there's interesting like different economic views here. So one would be like, are they imagining that the businesses that get started, like the soap one, would be able to somehow maintain, or that would sort of bootstrap an economy such that even if you took away this particular income, things would be going along better. It seems like they kind of have that idea. And then I guess also they're especially emphasizing that going to school gives you skills. And so there's kind of an assumption that if you have skills, the jobs will be there for you,
Yeah.
which is an interesting assumption. And I don't know to what degree it's true.
It's not true in America because most people are underemployed.
Right. So like, is this an example of fallacy of composition? I think so. Yeah. Well, not exactly. It's a, what's the term for it?
Yeah,
But
I think fallacy of composition.
If you take, yeah, it would be that. And also if you just look at like the correlation between who has current jobs and education, it'll definitely show that people with the jobs have more education. But it doesn't necessarily follow that more jobs would be available if everybody has that education.
Right.
Kind of to Richard's point, like if everyone gets more education, then the educational standard could just rise for the same jobs or people,
You guys familiar with fallacy of composition? So that's the one where if you are in a stadium watching a baseball game and you stand up, you get a better view. But if everybody stands up, nobody has a better view, but now everybody's standing up.
So the example here would be like if you take one kid who's from like a difficult, one poor kid and put them in a wonderful school and they get a fantastic education, like they're going to get a much better job, right? Because education correlates with your job. But if you give everybody a good education, if you have the same number of jobs, that's not going to be true anymore.
Right.
So, yeah.
So I think there is this assumption here that if you just kind of educate everyone, then they'll be able to be productive and last week we talked about Say's law.
Right.
Supply creates its own demand, that kind of thing. But if everybody's productive, then they can earn money, and then they can spend money, and all of that. Yeah. And I think that's not so clear, and that's because that's not kind of an automatic thing. That's a big part of the reason why basic income is so valuable, because you can't just produce things and then earn money. As an individual, you can, but as society as a whole, we can't just produce more and then more spending comes out of somewhere. Yeah.
I guess there's a little bit of it where, like, if you really did need people to have more skills or education to do certain things, like if a lot of people are illiterate, I feel like this could be more true in Brazil than it is in the United States. Because, like, maybe there is a real need for just, like, literate labor, and those people are just not there. Or, like, that would really bootstrap, like, more benefits in the economy than they have.
Yeah, you can't say that it won't have any of this effect at all, because certainly if you are educating your workers, your future workers, and they're able to be more productive, then you're building capacity in your economy to produce more.
Exactly, yeah.
You still need that other ingredient of how do you activate that capacity.
Right.
So you still need a mechanism to get money to people.
But let's assume this government like ours has, like, some indirect and, like, inefficient or whatever ways of doing that, like, probably boosting the capacity so dramatically would make potentially.
So maybe you boost the capacity through Bolsa Família, and then you activate the capacity through something like monetary policy or something like that. Yeah. But it's important to keep in mind here that it's already, just by virtue of people having money from this, it's already activating capacity, latent capacity that was there all along. They could have started a soap business if people had the money, and they just didn't because there was no money to spend. So it's all of these things, and I certainly think the economy will benefit from having a more educated workforce as well. Yep. Yeah.
You can look at these things as, in this case, as sort of the nastiest way of looking at it is, it's a form of charity, and you're supposed to work your way out of it, and it's supposed to go away because it's welfare.
Yes.
Or you could look at it like Andrew Yang describes it as, it's the freedom dividend is a dividend, and even rich people, get their dividends and keep their dividends. Or you can look at it as an economic stimulus. You should optimize your free market economy so that it's working as well as it can for everybody. And nobody really says, are we going to have to keep optimizing our economy? Well, everybody sort of is okay with the idea that some people in the government are going to have to keep optimizing the economy.
Yeah. I like that way of thinking about it, that you're never going to want to just not have good economic policy, right? And this is it's not a full basic income, but it's a very helpful economic policy if you think of it as economic policy. It really is, helps support the economy, and you take it away, then you don't have that support anymore. Yeah. All right.
I'm interested in this next one too.
The very last quote.
Oh man, we've never gotten through. Have we ever gotten through all of
Man, we could end early and have like a party or something. Third, Bolsa Família is sometimes equated with straightforward vote buying. That is unfair. Luis Inácio Lula da Silva's name is strongly associated with the scheme, even among some people in Alagoas who are unaware that he is Brazil's president. But their gratitude does not extend to support for his Workers' Party. There are signs that mayors who administer the program well get a reward in the polls, while those who do not suffer. For a relatively modest outlay, 0.8% of GDP, Brazil is getting a good return.
That's interesting. I feel like the thing about the mayors is not really a corruption problem. Administering this correctly is a part of their job and a part that impacts people's lives quite a bit.
Do you think they're getting rewarded for administering it well, or do you think they're getting rewarded for making sure that people are getting it?
What is the difference?
Well, administering it well means you're making sure that the people who qualify for it.
Oh
get
yeah,
it.
so I
And,
guess
yeah.
it could be corruption from the perspective of the qualifications, because like a
Right.
mayor that just doesn't really worry that much about whether your kids are in school or get vaccinated
Well,
might be more popular.
The 100% of the students in school, 100%.
Right,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
a really good point.
Will
yeah,
he
it's a good
get-
point.
He'll get reelected because all the people.
Yeah, that's
Get
a
the
good
money,
point.
yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
good point. So
Yeah.
if you're concerned about those qualifications, then that's a perverse incentive there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the qualifications only the students only have to attend like 85 days of school, as on the
Oh,
reading an
yeah.
article that talks about how in rural areas the kids are still able to like help with the harvest and attend
I see.
like 85 days of school, which is the minimum.
I see. Yeah.
But that it's in like urban areas, it gets a lot more economically beneficial for kids to be working as like maids and stuff, which is much harder to do if you're also going to school.
Yeah,
so that's
right.
one of the sort of opportunity costs
Yeah.
of going to school that the program is trying to
deal with, right?
deal with, to be like, okay, well, if we pay you,
Right.
and like Wikipedia says that like you get like 32 rays like per vaccinated kid, like up to 5 kids, and then like 38 like per youth, which is like 16 or 17 if they're attending school, like up to 2. So that's a sort of per
Right.
child cap. And it says it's given preferentially to a female head of household. So that sounds like if you had like a single dad, like maybe they could get it. I wasn't gonna like
Okay.
get down like a link rabbit hole, but
Yeah, that's interesting.
And it also could be that the program has changed somewhat since this
Since
article was
2008.
written.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and like I don't know how like up to date like the Wikipedia is, but like the
Right.
site is for like a 2010 like BBC News.
I mean, a lot has happened in Brazil in the last 10 years. I mean,
Yeah.
this was written, I think, before like oil prices really fell,
Yep.
which really hurt. You know, I mean, I think, was written sort of at the end of this very booming economic period.
Right. It was written, 2008, the year of the global financial crisis.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think since then, you know, this picture's gotten a lot more complicated. But I was just trying to figure out whether this new like far right wing government is trying to end the program or cut it back or make big changes, and it seems like they're not. It seems like they're they're sort of like maybe even trying to expand it so that they can kind of get credit for it or.
That's interesting, and that's a really interesting point about when you think about what would the politics of basic income be after it's in place, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
If it's something people get and depend on, they're not going to want to vote to remove it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At this point, it's a pretty old program.
Yeah.
Yeah.
15 years.
Yeah.
Mexico had one going for a while too, a similar program that had been going for a long time, and they ended it,
Really?
or they're ending it now. Yeah.
Huh. What was the
It's
justification?
because a lot of people who qualified for it didn't get it, and a lot of people who didn't qualify for it still got it because they didn't administrate it correctly.
I see.
Okay. So it sounds like maybe they're doing a better job in Brazil, or at least they're erring on the side of stream is okay. We are not receiving data from your encoder.
No, it's back.
It's a bad.
Okay. So did you hear what I said about inflation? So anyway, in Iran's case, there was a huge amount of inflation during the course of their kind of basic income like program, but it's at the same time they had all these sanctions and embargoes and everything, and you could say that the inflation is entirely due to that or entirely due to this, and it's really hard to untangle. What matters is that the amount of stuff that's being provided people for people from the economy has to match up with the spending that they undertake. So maybe in the presence of sanctions and embargoes, the level of cash assistance what does it mean to have inflation? It means there's too much spending compared to how much production there is. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I think in general, UBI type things work, in theory, work well in nations that are both very poor, like Brazil or India, and also very developed, in that the supply side is developed enough to make stuff to
Right.
sell to the poor people who now have money.
Right.
Yeah.
Whereas in some African nations, they're actually not making enough stuff, or they're not getting the vaccines or the mosquito bed nets. They don't have the distribution, the supply side to supply people, even if the people did have them.
Yeah, I think that's probably true, and I think it's also true that you could gradually get the economy there. You could kind of bootstrap it to that point. Like if you start with a very, very tiny basic income, like I mean, this you could consider maybe on the level of a very tiny basic income. Then people can start spending that money. Then that starts providing an incentive to build some capacity to produce stuff, because now there's a little bit of money there. Now once you have a little bit of capacity, you can give people a little bit more money, on and on. So I think you can kind of gradually get there. I think even in a place like Venezuela, you could have like a nominal basic income that's only a token amount of money. Obviously, you would also want to have a stable currency, and you couldn't set the basic income too high. But if you start by establishing a stable currency, then there's no reason why you couldn't have a very tiny basic income that is calibrated to whatever level your economy can sustain, and then build it from there. And then turn yourself into a country that has capacity, more like India or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I was going to jump in and say, like, in terms of the immediate effects and how much you could give people right away, maybe in countries with a lot of income inequality, it would actually in some ways work better, because I'm thinking those might be countries where you have like a lot of the infrastructure. Yeah. So it's not like the whole country has no infrastructure, but it's only working right now for the people that have money, and so you can just give more people. You might be able to give a bigger basic income in those countries.
Yeah.
Yeah. You have, like in India, you have fantastically huge inequality.
Yeah, exactly.
If you feel the need to have to pay for a UBI, you tax the billionaires, and that will easily pay for the UBI in India, which was like $1 a day or something very small. So in countries of vast inequality, it kind of works better. And then India actually has, a middle class supply sector that makes stuff and is
right. I guess that was my point. Yeah. Right.
I presume is modern enough that they can, turn on the assembly line again and make more stuff.
Yeah. And if any country is running excessively low interest rates through their monetary policy, they're trying to stimulate the economy in that way, then there's room for a basic income. You can start paying out a basic income. You can run a deficit, or you can tax if you feel like you want to tell a story about money coming from one place and going to another place. But you can start paying out a basic income, and then that can allow you to raise your interest rates. So monetary tightening, but fiscal expansion. And I think that might actually help. Those two things together could help bring down inflation. Because it could be the case that your monetary policy is so expansionary that in order to get kind of the result you want, it's causing too much inflation. But if you pay out a basic income, then you don't have to worry as much about, contracting the private financial sector, contracting, the amount of borrowing and stuff, because everyone has this base level, and that there's a base level of consumer spending that can sustain economic output. So in some sense, I think, there are cases where you could use a basic income to actually bring down inflation at the same time that you're boosting output. Does that make sense? So there's kind of two sides of this. One is that if you raise interest rates, then that's less borrowing in the financial sector. So that reduces the amount of spending, especially at the high end, people who spend a lot of money. And then the other side of it is that basic income increases the amount of spending, but it increases it in this kind of flat distribution, so that instead of just the same people having more money, you have more people having a smaller amount of money. So to the extent that you have the productive capacity, that creates an incentive for producers to produce more at lower prices rather than produce the same amount at higher prices. So those two things together can kind of balance out. And then you have a more stable financial sector too. I don't know what the monetary policy situation is in Brazil right now, but I do know that they've been having inflation problems, and they probably are reluctant to raise interest rates too much because they're worried about contracting the economy. Yeah. So they haven't commented since they said it went down again, but it looks good. Yeah. So I think you guys are on there. Type something or send something. Let us know if you can see us. Yeah.
Michael's question about what can we learn from this and be relevant to basic income made me think about an objection that I have heard kind of raised pretty often, which is, if you put in a basic income, then the next day the landlords will just like raise everybody's rent by that exact amount, and then you're back where you started, except the landlords are getting all this extra money. And I imagining some of these. I think you could probably find cases that would sort of fit the that kind of picture, like tenant farmers on a big plantation, or where you have that kind of power difference, and everybody knows that now everybody's getting this money, and that your recourse is to like pick up and emigrate, basically. Try your luck in the city, or find some other plantation owner who is more enlightened or something. I mean, it's I wonder if that kind of
housing
data would address some of those.
Housing is, I think, not a fair example because it's so regulated. The free market is just not working in housing at the moment.
Like in terms of building more housing and that.
Yeah, there's too many
Rent control.
zoning requirements,
Yeah.
so that the free market can't really operate in the sense of housing. If the zoning requirements were not around, and then poor people were all of a sudden richer, then developers of cheap apartments would say, I have millions of new customers for my cheap apartments. I'm going to run off and build them. Or people in cheaper cities or just cheaper places will say, the people don't need the jobs in the city, and they can now move to my cheap places.
Yeah.
If they have their UBI, if they were in the city because of that's where the jobs are, then they don't need the crummy jobs anymore, and they can move.
Yeah. So I think that's a good point. It's useful to keep in mind that the housing market is very much tied to the labor market. People need to live near where their job is, usually. If with a basic income, you are making it so that a portion of people's income is no longer tied to a location, that gives them more freedom to move around, or more freedom to decide where they want to live. So your point about emigration, trying out somewhere else, basic income actually gives people more freedom to do that. So that can help bring down housing prices, is what I usually argue. Even if you don't fix, zoning restrictions, people can go, there aren't horrible zoning restrictions in most places in America. Just most places where people want to live. That's where they are. But with basic income, it gives people more freedom to live in different places. And you can also...
But it would have to be high enough that a significant number of people would say, good, like I'm not going to try to have a job in...
Well, I think the people at the margins will be the ones causing the effect. So... So if it's a small amount, then you'd see a small effect. But I don't think there's like some small amount of basic income that would cause rents to rise, and then once the basic income gets high enough, it causes rents to come back down again. I think any level of basic income would kind of generally put downward pressure on prices in the housing market, including rents. And then a high enough basic income would actually start to cause them to come down rather than to continue to go up. It's also useful to think about basic income when you're thinking about the housing market it does two different things. So one thing is that it makes it so that a portion of people's income is no longer tied to location, and then the other thing is that it increases people's total income. You could imagine a scenario in which only the first effect was there, in which people have their existing income, you put the basic income in place, they get the income from the basic income, but then their income decreases from jobs or something like that because basic income eliminates their job or something like that. In those cases, you're not actually changing the people's income, you're just changing how much of it is tied to a location, right? And then you would see only that effect. You would see only the additional freedom to choose where to live. And I think that would have the downward pressure on housing prices. If you set basic income too high, then that causes inflation. I guess it's an interesting question to ask if the housing market would be the limit, or if just other kind of consumer good, the supply of other consumer goods would be the limit to how high you could set the basic income.
I think at the beginning, it kind of doesn't matter because there's so much consumer debt that the first, $5 trillion of UBI would just be going to student debt, mortgages, credit cards, auto loans. Everybody seems to have a debt to be paid off.
Yeah.
So you could actually make the country awash in UBI, and it would just go to these basically canceling. It would be paper transactions as people pay off their debts, and then eventually people would actually start making some money. Well, how about, to generalize your comment, once people get $1,000 a month, why doesn't everybody, the landlord and everybody in the country, just raise their prices or double their prices? Because everybody's all of a sudden so much more rich. Well, I hope that capitalism would happen.
Competition would control the prices.
Yeah, that the free market, buyers and sellers, and that whole thing would fix everything. It might involve a great migration or sort of a revolution, big changes in the workforce, and all of that. But the idea, as I imagine it, it would all reach a new equilibrium that's where everybody is happy.
One thing that your point got me thinking about, Nick, though, is back to this example, it does seem like it's a concrete example that, as you said, goes to a lot of people, has some economic effects, and it does seem like it's having effects like creating new businesses and people are buying new products. Like, it doesn't seem like you just see them buying exactly the same things at a higher price.
Yes.
At least so far as this article is implying, which only gives us a tiny bit of information.
Well, I mean, if their landlords took all of their Bolsa Familia money and just raised the rent, they wouldn't be able to buy the soap from that guy.
There'd be no incentive
for example.
the businesses and stuff. So I'm kind of inferring that they're like getting some other.
I guess I was sort of thinking back to the conversation about corruption, and you have this the very poor, very rural state that they were talking about, Alagoas, and we were talking about organized crime, trying to aggregate people's, but I was just fantasizing that a more likely version of that is you have this town and have all the powers basically in the hands of the big landowner,
right,
who's calling the shots, and the simplest form of corruption is for him to extract that money coming in from the federal government just by kind of jacking up people's what he's selling, the prices in his store and the rent that people pay.
Yeah, and I don't even know if I would call that corruption. I would just call that he's going to want to get as much profit as possible, and he always wants to do that.
Right. Price gouging, that's what they do.
Sure. So the question is, what prevents that from happening? Yeah. And I think the part of the answer is that people have more freedom to leave.
Yeah, and there's some ability to make new houses, for example. I mean, it's not totally impossible, so there's some of that too. And there could be more pressure to change the zoning as well, if there's a lot more people wanting the housing. Yeah,
I don't know to what extent Brazil has kind of the same zoning problems that we have here. Probably a little bit, but they have the favelas, and people find places to live and they get by.
What are the favelas?
Like shanty town in cities.
People making their own houses and stuff?
Yeah, that kind of stuff. Yeah. obviously that would be a zoning violation in Cambridge.
Right, and maybe it is there too, and people don't pay attention.
It could be.
Or maybe it's
whether it's lax enforcement or they just don't have those restrictions. It's probably a combination.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, if you imagine a situation where there's lots of zoning restrictions and you introduce a basic income, like I was saying, people can move somewhere where there aren't so many zoning restrictions. They can even start new cities. There's perhaps an incentive to start new communities, new cities where you can build a lot of really dense housing, get a lot of people to live there, and that could potentially become a more prosperous city that's not burdened by, at least not initially burdened by, the restrictions that you see in existing cities. Right now, it's really hard to start a new city because nobody's going to move there if there aren't any jobs. Whereas if everyone has a location-independent income, then you might be roughing it a little bit compared to being in a city, but you'd get a place to live and you could form a community, and then jobs can come from
I
that
heard
too.
that they improve public transportation between cities. That there would be
In Brazil?
they could build infrastructure. They could build cities in between the major ones, and then they can commute to either one.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah.
In fact, this book actually says that before the Great Recession and the housing bubble and all that, people actually the market sort of was working. People in San Francisco and Boston really were getting fed up with the prices, with the rents.
Yeah.
Or they were owners and they said, oh, well, now I can sell and move and pocket a fortune along the way. So the people actually did move, in great numbers.
Right.
To Arizona and Florida and the secondary places.
But then the question is, who are they selling to? And they're selling to, a lot of times they're selling to speculators who want to, flip the house and sell it again. And that's not sustainable. Yeah.
I saw a presentation today speculating about hyperloops and how they could kind of do what you're talking about, like make a lot more places livable because it would be an advance in technology.
You mean the Elon Musk Hyperloop?
Yeah,
that type of thing?
Because it was at the MIT Media Lab, so
yeah.
But it would be like the like right now we think there's a certain kind of max speed by which we can go from one place to the next. So that kind of limits your geography in terms of if you are wanting to be close enough either for a job or just to have fun in San Francisco and don't want to be out in the boonies, if you're 2 hours away by driving, that kind of sucks. But 2 hours away by driving is like 10, 15 minutes on the hyperloops or whatever. So that technology could make a huge difference in terms of people having more geography that was livable.
Yeah.
They're trying to build one in Qatar.
Oh, are they? Mm-hmm. Do they have the technology? I didn't even know they had it.
Only in Qatar.
Does it work?
A prototype.
Oh, I didn't know it was that close. I thought it was kind of like a pipe dream.
Yeah, pipe dream. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really cool.
What do you do? Do you sit in a chair?
What? Yeah.
You just sit in a chair and go zooming through?
I think they put it in they can put a car on this track thing, and then it's in a vacuum.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
I wouldn't want to crash in one of those.
Nope.
But it's not like a lot of G-force because it's accelerating at a comfortable rate, but it just keeps accelerating.
Right.
And then it slows down. And
so you're accelerating halfway and then decelerating the other half. Right?
Exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah. So Michael says, with basic income, people would feel more secure to leave their landlords. Yeah, I think that's a big part of the thing. I don't know, Nick, if you saw the article I wrote entitled "Universal Basic Income Fixes the Housing Market." It's not on the Gresham site; it's on Medium, but I can send that to you if you're interested. You can show it to your friends. But yeah, I mean, I think in terms of why housing prices are so high, it's a combination of things. One is that it's tied to the labor market, and then the other is that interest rates are really low. It's easy to get a mortgage to buy a house. Basic income also allows us to raise interest rates, makes mortgages more expensive. You'd have to pay more for your house outright, that kind of thing. So that can help rein in housing prices as well, which translates over to rents at the same time. Yeah. Do you think the amount of people that rent versus do something else, like own a house, would change with basic income?
Like own a little house, I think Michael's referencing.
Oh.
Renters in tiny houses.
Like own a little house.
Oh,
would change.
like tiny houses.
I think that's an interesting question, and I don't really have an intuition for how to answer that question.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It could be that more people rent because they are not tied down to jobs as much anymore,
So
and they don't want to
want to move or something.
Right, they want to maintain that flexibility on where they live. They don't want to own a property.
Or if like mortgages are really hard to get, like you said.
Yeah, I mean, you could imagine like the future. I imagine with self-driving cars is that you have Uber, but it's all self-driving cars, and nobody owns their own car. They just kind of rent a car for the trip.
Right.
You can imagine something similar happening with housing, where there's
Right.
like lots of housing developments, and people rent it for as much as they want. Airbnb type stuff or longer term stuff, that kind of thing.
I guess there's like a few
Yeah.
more, I don't know how important this is to people, but there are more downsides to not being able to alter the property yourself. Like your car, maybe you don't care that much
Sure.
what it looks like inside, but you might want to have like your house a bit more tailored to you.
Yeah, so I'm guessing there would be demand for that, so people would be willing to pay more for that, and that could either mean you rent and you pay a higher price to be able to do all these things, or you
Right.
buy your own place.
Right.
Yeah.
I think something here is that a lot of people rent with roommates.
Right.
They'd rather not have roommates. It's
Right.
change the composition there.
Yeah. You could imagine people wanting to live by themselves, but being willing to live in a much smaller unit in order to have that privacy and autonomy and stuff. Yeah.
But then why wouldn't we see that now? Like that could be happening now too.
It could be happening now.
But they don't have the smaller places. The places in like Boston, they were built in like the 50s or before then for larger families.
Right.
Because that's
Yeah.
what they had back then.
I think that's the answer. So with basic income, you might not see different types of housing units in Cambridge or Somerville, but you might see new housing, new cities like I was talking about being emerging and that kind of thing. Like there are a lot of places that have very small housing units, and like in Japan they have like
Yeah.
micro apartments, and even Manhattan has very small housing
It does,
units.
yeah.
Yeah.
But I guess, I mean, it is still less efficient because you need certain things for every place needs a bathroom, but you might be able to have one bathroom for a bunch of roommates, things like that. So you have to kind of replicate that in the small unit.
Yeah. There's efficiency to be gained by sharing housing units as
Right.
well. Yeah.
And like with living rooms too. I mean, maybe people don't feel like they need a living room, but usually you can have one for like a bunch of people.
Yeah. So how do you think that applies to Brazil?
I mean, I guess if we knew more about like the economic effects of the money, it would be interesting to know like did the housing options that people took change? Like the answer to that, there might be some interesting answers to this question in terms of what happened in Brazil. Did people start living in different arrangements, like smaller numbers of people in the same place, or did they build like new small places, or who knows, right?
Did
Was
they
there-
tear
was there
down the
out
villas and
migration?
make regular apartments? Up the code?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
What'd you
Did it
think?
reverse migration to cities from rural areas?
Right, that'd be interesting. Yeah,
Or
That's
did
a good
it
question.
accelerate it? Or-
right.
Yeah, I can imagine it going either way, right? If people are not so poor that they have to be subsistence farmers anymore, and they can move to the city or something like that.
Right.
Yeah, and I think with basic income, what I would imagine would happen would be everyone would still want to live in cities. They might not want to live in the current cities that are really expensive. They might, revitalize more depressed cities, like Detroit or Nashville, or.
So like the really rural living might also go down. Like people would move into cities, but like cheaper cities. You think?
My sense is that a lot of people living in rural places might choose to move into the city, but then there are some people who just want to live near trees, and
What are you guys talking about?
yeah, and I think there are people who currently live in cities who would want to live maybe not necessarily in rural areas, but at least in the suburbs, that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah. So it'd be interesting to see what happens.
Can I take us on a tiny different track?
Yeah, go ahead.
This article mentions that this was tried in New York City. Or-
Yes,
Okay. Do you know how things worked out there?
Yeah.
it ended in 2010.
So how long did they do it for?
3 years.
And what do you think? Do you know?
My sense was that it did not result in the outcomes that they wanted, and that's why they discontinued it. It was called, what was it called? Opportunity NYC, I think. Yeah. I don't know I don't know specifically what happened, but I think they were probably thinking about it in a similar way to the way the Brazilians are thinking about Bolsa Família as kind of like a thing that people would only need temporarily to kind of get them back on their feet, and it ended up maybe not working out that way.
Well,
Yeah.
was it tied to conditions the way that this?
I don't know. I don't know about it.
I believe it was, conditional cash transfer program by Mayor Michael Bloomberg. And the conditions. Let's find out what the conditions were. Oh, it was also I think a big part of it is that the funding ran out. There were various like nonprofit foundations, and also the Bloomberg Family Foundation itself were funding it. And the program just ended on August 31st, 2010. The cash payments go to the family, almost always to the mother or other female head of household. Parents can receive from $40 to $100 a month if they keep up with responsibilities such as taking their children to the doctor or keeping them in school. So very similar.
Not that much money.
It's not that much money,
especially for New York. It's expensive.
Yeah, I think I want to kind of go back to what I was saying before, which is that I think a lot of it is just to provide the incentive to do these other
I
things.
see. It's not really thought of as like an income for people.
There's other benefit programs that provide a lot more a lot more income than just that. And this is just a New York City thing. It's on top of whatever state and federal benefits people get.
Good point. I wonder if it had any effects on like different outcomes. I wonder if they measured anything.
Yeah. So the data shows that the program, in terms of overall poverty, created the greatest improvement in reducing the share of families living in severe poverty from 30% to 17%. And that's pretty good.
How did it do that?
And increased the likelihood that parents had bank accounts.
Wow.
Not going to need a bank account if you don't have any money to put in it. In terms of education, positive results were mostly seen in high school and less in elementary and middle school students. The program group was shown to have an increased likelihood of passing at least 2 Regents exams by 6%, and increased likelihood of having a 95% or better attendance by 15%.
Pretty good.
The effects of the program on improving health was marginal, as the most significant statistic was an increase in the receipt of the last 2 preventive dental care visits by 10%. The program also had marginal effects in enhancing the parents' work and training, as it had a 2 to 3% greater likelihood of receiving training certificate or associate degree.
How did it have such a big effect on poverty?
It turns out that when you have no money, a tiny bit of money makes a big difference. Yeah.
That's a lot. That's interesting.
Yeah.
And high school students, they don't have to go to get a part-time job so they can attend school better and get better grades and things.
Yeah.
I wonder, like things, I guess, like having a bank account, then you don't have to pay extra money out of your check when you cash it, things like that. So there might have been like other returns to it.
Yeah. Cool.
It's pretty impressive.
Well, let's get people's final thoughts on Bolsa Familia.
Well, what about the Eastern Europe they mentioned? It has some program. I've never heard of those.
Let's see. Eastern Europe, you say?
Mm-hmm. It says something about that. Just take Control F and then Eastern Europe or just Europe. They're right there.
Yes.
Oh, interesting.
Who was about to begin work on similar schemes for Eastern Europe. So that's all we know.
I don't know anything about that.
Don't know anything about that.
I wonder if they did.
So it was like about to in 2008.
Right, and I wonder if they actually did anything.
Maybe since the financial crisis, they just scrapped it or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. I think a lot of people's plans changed in 2008.
Yeah.
I do know there's, we talked about Italy. Italy has kind of a cash assistance program that's also kind of conditional and means tested and, that kind of thing. So yeah, I don't know.
Interesting.
Let's get final thoughts on Bolsa Familia in particular
Well,
as it relates to basic income. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting to see some of the macroeconomic effects. I wish that we had learned even more about them. Like, I guess it's been going on for a lot longer now, so it'd be really interesting to see, like, if a lot of these other businesses have started, what happened to their housing, you know, what's happening to the economies in general.
Yeah.
If this is, you said they're having trouble with inflation, is this contributing to that, or is that entirely about other kinds of spending?
Like oil money.
Yeah, so those kinds of questions I'd be interested in knowing more about.
Yeah. Steve.
Well, Bolsa Família has the usual problems of the means testing and the benefits cliff. People are encouraged to not get too rich or they lose their benefits. And the more means testing, the more bureaucracy, the more chance for fraud by the recipients and corruption at the municipal and federal level by government officials, which UBI doesn't have any of those problems.
Okay, Nick.
It seems like it's been really successful, and I guess that's the part that stands out to me.
Yeah.
It's a really solid data point to keep in mind about the positive impacts of giving people money.
Yeah.
I like your point about when you give very poor people just a little bit of money, it does a lot to make things better. And I like that they have an incentive to get kids in school and vaccinated. So.
All right.
I'm sorry to point about the success. Like, it feels like it's very effective for what it's trying to do, which feels largely different than what basic income is trying to do. That, I mean, you mentioned like the soap business and stuff, but definitely like the Wikipedia article about it, and most of the stuff I was reading online about it is about like, oh, it improves like kids going to school, reduces child labor, has like health benefits because the kids are getting meals at school. The Wikipedia has a thing about how it like lowered suicide rates, and so there's some sort of like not random, but sort of like positive externalities. But it does feel like, okay, it's very good at improving like child health and education, and sort of the like correlated things like lowering child labor. So it feels like it's great that it's succeeding at what it's trying to do. But like we talked about, it feels like that's mostly, like, largely not exactly what basic income is trying to do. It's like, okay, with basic income, we would hope that yes, it would also have these positive outcomes, but this feels much more targeted. So it's good that it's succeeding at its targets, but
yeah. Richard?
Well, today I read an article on NPR about how Syrians that poverty has more of an impact on like grades and things like that than PSTD from like bombings and genocide and whatever. So, aiding families in poverty and getting them incentives to put their children through education, it seems like it would have a similar effect to, or maybe even greater effect, since they don't have the PSTD and issues like that, than just about any other program besides like a basic income without any of the restrictions.
So Michael says, universality and unconditionality of UBI to me seems to have much more potential than programs like Bolsa Família. And Mitchell says, it would be great to get updates. The articles I looked at today are from this year, all quoted articles from 2008 to 2012. And did not use recent stories and studies.
That's too bad.
Yeah, I kind of found the same thing. And, you know, I would have loved to have had a more recent article, but the best article I found was this one from 2008.
Right.
I think Bolsa Família is succeeding at some of the stuff it's trying to do. I think it's succeeding at some of the stuff that it wasn't intended to do, that you know, basic income would also some of the benefits that basic income would also provide, and some of that success may be viewed as a failure of some of the things it is trying to do. So, for example, if people are continuing to depend on it and it's continuing to support the economy, then some people might see that particular aspect of it as somewhat of a failure. And I would see that as, if you're thinking about it from a basic income perspective, that's more of a success. I agree with Michael, that the universality and unconditionality of UBI are really, really important. But I wouldn't understate how important it is that Bolsa Familia comes with no work requirement. That's one of the biggest things that prevents some of our cash benefit programs from giving people more freedom from being stuck in the labor market, more freedom to spend their time how they choose. So that's, I mean, do I think that Bolsa Familia could be a stepping stone to get us closer to a basic income? I don't know, maybe. I mean, even reading this article, seeing some of the benefits it talks about that were maybe not initially, intended, like the people creating the soap businesses and stuff like that. Maybe people look at it and say, hey, all this good stuff is happening and we actually think it's good now, and maybe we want to keep it going for that reason, and maybe expand it if our goal shifts to kind of supporting some of these other benefits that we're seeing from this program.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my hope. It could help, and I certainly think people who talk about basic income would be smart to look at programs like this and some of the other programs we've talked about in this discussion group. So yeah, cool. Interesting discussion. Bolsa Familia has come up a lot, and I'm glad we finally did one on Bolsa Familia.
Yeah.
Next week, we're going to be on Wednesday again, and we're going to be talking about value-added tax. So value-added tax is the tax that Andrew Yang wants to use in conjunction with his freedom dividend basic income. So we're going to talk about to what extent a value-added tax makes sense in general, in combination with a basic income, and all of that. So we'll see you guys next week. Thanks to you guys on the live stream. Yeah.